Irish Heritage Trust, and absolutely delighted to be able to welcome my colleague, Professor Mark McGowan. Professor McGowan will be well known to some of you in the room, Professor at the University of Toronto. He has worked extensively on the relationship between Ireland and Canada, and is currently working with myself. I'll take another here. I'm currently working with myself on the Historic Houses Global Crossroads project. Maybe Mark, you'll have something more to say about that. So I'll just hand over to you.
Oh, thank you very much. So thank you for having me here today. You're getting double doses of the University of Toronto, it seems, in successive weeks. And I tend to, at this time of day, to rather speak loosely to slides, because I find that after lunch it goes to my eyelids, and so I want to sort of keep everyone awake, I hope, and talk about something that has been a project that's linked to the Historic Houses project in a very serendipitous way. Jason King and I have been working together for a couple of years on this project on either side of the Atlantic Ocean, and it was, I think, the Historic Houses project sort of picked up vibes that something was happening in Canada with regard to Indigenous people, Indigenous spaces in Canada, and so that's where essentially this talk is coming from. Jason and I, several years ago at the Famine Summer School in Strokestown, were listening to a presentation from Leanne Howe, who was elder with the Choctaw Nation in Oklahoma, talking about the Choctaw donation. And over coffee, or it could have been another beverage, I don't quite remember, Jason and I kept thinking, if there was one group of Indigenous peoples in North America that gave, surely to goodness there had to be others. And slowly but surely, after teasing out records, we discovered something, and that's what I want to present to you today. In fact, this project has grown so much that it is now, as you'll see, a floating exhibit going through Canada, and I'll highlight that in a moment. But this portrait of Peter Jones, Ogima of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, was actually commissioned for this project once the letters from Indigenous peoples in Canada came to the light of day, and in a sense, not discovered, but rediscovered, because they had been what I would call hidden in plain sight. They were actually on a Canadiana website, but you had to forage through about 1,400 documents to find them. So, and that's what I always say to my students, it's persistence, persistence, persistence. And then suddenly, through all of that massive ore, the nuggets begin to appear. And so this Philip Cote is an Anishinaabe Ojibwe artist in Toronto. He was commissioned and he painted this painting called essentially Sacred Feathers, Kakakawanabe, which was Peter Jones's Mississauga name. So we'll talk a little bit more about, or at least I'll talk a little bit more about Peter Jones in a minute. Talking about the famine in Ireland is like bringing coal to Newcastle, so I'm not going to. What I do want to say, though, is that the famine was very well known, and the tragedy of Ireland was very well known in British North America as early as 1846, but certainly in 1847. And certainly it was known in a way in which Canadians were already trying to analyze what was happening in Ireland. And this is on the cusp of migration. So this is prior to any of those so-called coffin ships actually landing in British North America. But I don't normally read slides, but for those online and for those in the back row, the terrible affliction of famine is sweeping like pestilence over Ireland and parts of Scotland, spreading disease and death on every hand. The immediate cause of the visitation is the failure, almost general, of the potato crop. Millions in Ireland and thousands in Scotland have long subsisted on the scantiest amounts of food that would support human life. A superabundant population or a defective system of tenure checked agricultural improvement and compelled the mass of the population in many districts to rely for subsistence almost entirely on the potato crop. So they're not just reporting it, they're already trying to figure out what's happening or what structures have been in place that this tragedy would happen with the destruction of this crop. So it's well known. What also is known is that there were international relief efforts set up quite early. As we know, the British Relief Committee was the largest, gathering resources from around the globe. Queen Victoria, despite the myth-making of the £5 donation, actually gave £2,000. Sultan Abdul Majid Khan of the Ottoman Empire 1,000, although he had offered 10,000, that no one can give more than Her Majesty. And Tom Thumb gave $50 US, just to put the international aid in context here. I had mentioned before that the Choctaw and the Cherokee First Nations of the United States had also donated. They had brought donations to Captain William Armstrong at Fort Smith in Arkansas, and they had given, and this is a disputed figure, $170 or $710, depending on which editor was dyslexic at the time in the United States. We have no written records from either of these groups other than the newspaper reports of their donation. And Annalise Strout has written very well on this, so I'm not going to develop it. But as you can see at Middleton outside of Cork, we have the Kindred Spirits sculpture to commemorate this particular donation. And there's been a new installation at Strokestown as well to commemorate the Choctaw donation. But this beautiful bowl symbolizing the food within these feathers to commemorate this particular donation. And it's made even more profound by the fact that not even a generation before, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole were forcibly removed, beginning with Andrew Jackson's presidency, throughout in what was called the Trail of Tears, and thousands died. And so identifying very carefully and closely with the tragedy in Ireland, the Cherokee and the Choctaw make these donations. Now, the historiography has now become recently clouded because of the controversy of both nations being slaveholders. And did this largesse come out of the earnings of slave labor? In fact, the Cherokee and the Choctaw both had regiments in the Confederate Army later during the Civil War. I'm going to let the Americans sort out this historiographical conundrum. As a Canadian, I'm just going to be silent on it. But I wanted to put it out on the table to know that the narratives are being challenged even as I speak and as you are here. So, what of British North America? The scant evidence that we had, that Jason and I looked at, essentially was this one phrase in a letter written by Lord Elgin, the Governor General of Canada, to Earl Grey, when he says, "Several Indian tribes have expressed a desire to share in relieving the wants of their suffering white brethren." So if Lord Elgin is alert to the fact that something is happening among First Nations in Canada, maybe there is something there. As we used to say as Boy Scouts back in the day, you know, where there's smoke, there must be fire. And so it was now time to tease out where that fire actually may be. Now, there were a variety of relief in British North America at the time. Some government-sponsored, okay, some by private and non-denominational charities in British North America. Churches and religious groups supplied some relief. There were individual relief efforts. And this is a newspaper, the Morning Courier from St. John's, Newfoundland. And again, it puts the kind of spirit that goes into British North American donations in some sort of context. This is a list of 507 donors who gave 1,090 pounds sterling in 1847 to Irish famine relief. Now, understanding that about 40% of the population of the colony of Newfoundland was either of Irish birth or descent, that resonates. But this should resonate even more. In 1846, not a year before, St. John's, the most important city in Newfoundland, burned to the ground. All of the shops, all of the stores, most of the houses were completely decimated by fire. And yet, within 9 months, 507 Newfoundlanders came forward, from the mayor of the city right down to fishermen who had been dispossessed because their boats had burned, gave this amount of money. So we should put these donations in some sort of context. Very recently, a year ago, as part of the Global Irish Famine Way, we were in St. John's, Newfoundland, which is mile 1 of the Canadian route, where bronze shoes commemorate the travels of those from the Irish famine, in this case in British North America, and eventually throughout the world as this historic heritage trail expands. We were there at St. John the Baptist Basilica, which towers over the harbor in St. John's, and over 200 people gathered for an ecumenical service to commemorate the beginning of this trail in Canada. And there was a poster with this sheet enlarged, and it was moving to see families who are still there, Walshes, Fitzgeralds, going up to see whether their families were on this particular tribute to those donors at the time. So just for those of you who are mathematically inclined, these are the exchange rates that I've been working with. Canadians used a pound until the 1850s when they went to decimal currency, but 1 Canadian pound was worth less than a pound sterling. So you can do all of these calculations in your head. 1 pound, 4 shillings, 4 pence Canadian equal 1 pound sterling. So when I'm talking about pounds here on in, I'm talking about Canadian pounds. 1 Canadian pound was worth $4 US. And so I've used inflation calculators to give you sort of a sense of what the current value of these donations were. So just to give you a sense, for Canadian audiences, I even have to include a map because some Canadians are geographically challenged. The area that I'd be dealing with would be essentially what is now today the province of Quebec and the province of Ontario. In those days, Canada West and Canada East, they were joined as a federation around the Great Lakes. So for those of you who are more familiar with the United States, Boston is here, New York is here, Buffalo is here, Detroit is here. I do that for Natalie's benefit being from Michigan. So you get a sense of place as well. Many of the first indications that Jason and I found of potential donations came in the Montreal area of what is now the province of Quebec and then Canada East. And it was there, this is the Black Stone, which commemorates the burial of, as it said on the stone, close to 6,000 Irish immigrants at Point St. Charles in the summers of 1847 and 1848. And it was this visible suffering that was seen in the fever sheds outside of Montreal that prompted some of the first donations that we discovered. I mean, in fact, 36 members of the Sœurs de Charité, or the Grey Nuns, worked as frontline responders. There were close to 3,300 deaths in the first year. The Bishop of Montreal contracted typhus himself, nearly died, but didn't. But the mayor of Montreal died, and the chancellor of the Diocese of Montreal died as well. So people put themselves on the line right across British North America as Irish refugees were received. In fact, I've now found 82 first responders from colony to colony who died serving in the fever sheds. But what we discovered was the Mohawks of Kahnawake, which is Indigenous territory across the river from Montreal, had an oral tradition. Christine Zachary-Deaume, in a film that Jason essentially put together many years ago, talked about a donation of $150, we presume American, that was made to Irish famine relief from the Mohawks of Kahnawake. We also discovered later, actually this year, that an additional 6 pounds, 5 shillings, or $25 US was sent by the Mohawks of Kahnawake to the General Joint Relief Fund, which I'll talk about in a minute. But more importantly, seeing the suffering just across the St. Lawrence River from their reserve area, they actually brought food from their gardens to the fever sheds as a tangible and interpersonal way of trying to relieve the suffering of the Irish in the Montreal area, or Tiotiake as it is called in the Haudenosaunee language. This is actually Théophile Hamel's painting called The Typhus. It's the only known Canadian original portrait done during the famine, and it gives you a sense of the Grey Sisters here, the Sisters of Providence, the Sœurs de Bon Pasteur, and then, of course, Bourget, the bishop, can't be missing from the picture. He's there in the background. I'm sorry for the quality of the picture because it's in a little chapel at the Montreal waterfront called Notre-Dame de Bon Secours, and it's actually on the ceiling of the foyer. So some of the things you do as a historian, you don't imagine. You lie on your back and you take a photograph of it, things you do for scholarship. Right? So the first hints we have, the first little embers are coming from Montreal. Then discovered that Archbishop Joseph Signé of Quebec City had actually sent out a petition to collect for Irish famine relief. And as I moved through, some of the French newspapers at the time reported that the Abenaki, an Anishinaabe people living south of the St. Lawrence River, had given 15 shillings, or 15 pounds, 10 shillings. So you do the math and you can figure out the American dollars. And Le Jeune Lorette is where the Huron-Wendat, another Haudenosaunee people, actually had been relocated in the 17th century from what is now my home province of Ontario. They gave 10 pounds, 15 shillings. And more recently, as the famine commemoration took place in Quebec City, the chief of the Huron-Wendat was invited down from Lorette. Yeah, they had no idea that they had given this money in 1847. So the story is beginning to build as we move from east to west. All of these figures are derived from the Bagot Report. He was Governor General of Canada in 1845, and a report had been commissioned on the state of Indigenous peoples within the United Province of Canada. So the Bagot Report gives us fairly what we think are the most accurate numbers as to how many people we're talking about. So here, a reserve area of 189 souls gives 10 pounds, 15 shillings, which is substantial. The Abenaki, a little more populated, and these would all be Roman Catholic Indigenous peoples, as would be reported by Governor Bagot, and I'll talk about that later. So, and again, this is a slide not to insult anyone's intelligence about who the First Nations are, but I would have to use this slide in Canada as well because of a knowledge gap about who First Nations are. So as we move west to Canada West, we can see that the Haudenosaunee peoples, a distinctive sedentary agricultural group, are focused in this area here of the Six Nations. And these are the Six Nations, the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Tuscarora, who actually came up from the American South. The vast majority of the Indigenous peoples, though, in this region are Anishinaabe, which simply means the people. And so they're described variously as Mississaugas, Ojibwe, Algonquin, Ottawa, as you move throughout various territories. Ojibwe identifying here, Saugeen here, up here, Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Mississauga in the central area. So just a little bit of background here. Indigenous peoples in this part of the province, so I've focused on settlement here, were absolutely crucial to the British keeping control of these colonies. They were military allies and joined in alliances with the British and with local militia, and of course, most famously in making sure that the Americans didn't conquer this part of British North America between 1812 and 1814, although the current president of the United States certainly has desires in that direction and probably deeply regrets the failure of Madison and company back in the early 19th century. After the 1830s, though, the American threat is muted and the Indigenous peoples become a problem for British settlement. They're in the way. As opposed to being invaluable allies, they're in the way. And control over what they called Indian affairs was passed from the military authorities to civilian. And that's really important to this story because it's in the civilian documentation okay, the civil secretary of the government, and this new Indian department that's created, essentially run by non-military personnel, that really is crucial to this particular story. The superintendent in this region from 1845 to 1858 was a man by the name of Thomas Gummersall Anderson. And essentially, all of these groups reported through agents to Anderson, who was essentially chief of this section's Indian department. Many of the treaties that essentially bound the government and Indigenous peoples were essentially written and executed between 1781 and 1851. And some of them are quite, if I can use the very illustrious word cockamamie. One was called, one of the early ones was Gunshot Treaty, that the territory that between the lakeshore and that could be heard within a gunshot then became part of the British settlement. Or the Walking Man's Treaty, where they improved upon the gunshots, so the distance that a man could walk from the shores of Lake Ontario into the interior in one day constituted the treaty territory. Very scientific, and certainly something that the British would hold to once they started building other treaties. But if you consider that one of the treaties essentially ceded all of the territory between what is now Trenton, Ontario, and York, which is now Toronto, it's a massive, millions of acres ceded by Indigenous peoples in this period. And we're going to talk about some of them in a few minutes. In February of 1847, the most sort of formidable relief effort was established by a group of Scottish and Irish expats and descendants in the city of Montreal. In fact, they called it the Joint Irish and Scottish Relief Fund. So it was identified too that the Scots in the Highlands and in the islands were also suffering from the potato disaster. And so some of the monies would go to Scotland, some of the monies that collected would go to Ireland. And so Lord Elgin himself gave 70 pounds, Canadian, not sterling. Mayor John Mills, who actually died shortly thereafter in Montreal, gave 100 pounds, as did the Roman Catholic seminarians. There was a great ecumenical gesture here under this fund, Catholic and Protestant working together for Irish and Scottish relief. Okay, the totals for Canada West by after St. Patrick's Day were almost 3,000 pounds. Toronto alone subscribed 800 pounds. The village of Galt, on the other hand, just a small settlement, 50 pounds. The actual total by May was just over 7,000 pounds, with about 70% being sent to Ireland and 22% sent to Scotland. And the others, by May, refugees were arriving and they thought some of this money has to stay here to essentially finance the relief stations that were being established right along Ontario's transportation corridor. Just to give you a sense, the current value of these was over £500,000 sterling in today's currency. That's how much was raised, or about $1,023,000 Canadian dollars. So that gives you a sense of how much this relief effort is in terms of present dollars and pounds. Now we get to the heart of the story. And the heart of the story is Thomas Gummersall Anderson, not of Irish descent at all. Like actually, in fact, he's a United Empire Loyalist descendant from the United States in the American Revolution. He writes this on the 17th of March to all of the native groups within his jurisdiction. And I'm going to read it out because it's really important to get a sense of how he's phrasing this. He writes, "My dear brethren, there are a few of you who have not at some period of your lives felt the cravings of hunger, but a merciful God has thus far preserved you from the miseries of famine, and none of you have seen their children, their fathers and mothers, their husbands, wives dying around them for want of food." Problem there. "Brethren, this is now the lamentable case with some of your white friends. Hundreds in Ireland and Scotland are daily passing into the land of spirits because they have not food to keep them alive." Look at the way he phrases that, into the land of spirits. "Brethren, your great mother, the Queen, and all of your white brethren throughout the world are collecting money and other necessities to save their lives. You also have the means of contributing to the relief of your suffering and dying fellow subjects. Inform me by letter of the amount you wish to give, and I will forward your great father at Montreal, which would be Lord Elgin, the Governor General, representative of the Crown, who is pleased when we show acts of kindness to our fellow creatures. This goes out right across the province to all of the bands. There's a picture of a painting of Anderson from a panel from the Traveling Roadshow, but I thought you actually should see what Gummerson Anderson looked like. The response is almost immediate. This comes from the Beausoleil Reserve, which is up in the northern part of the province. Chief John Sagny says, your brother has read your letter to his brother chiefs. Please park that notice. He's read the letter to his brother chiefs. First, really important point. Secondly, who expressed great pity for their white brethren. Second important point. Who have unanimously agreed to place at their disposal the Great Father in Montreal for the relief of our white friends. Third, the idea of common consent among the chiefs. The sum is small compared with the large sums we are told has been sent to our white friends by their brethren. Fourth point, we are poor. And we are poor and give with the best of our ability and with willingness. Each one of the letters we have comes from individual bands, co-signed essentially by either the missionary or the schoolmaster who is attached, which is why you have a witness, N.B. Hamilton, who was on the reserve at Beausoleil. And this is the beginning of a sheaf of close to 16 letters. The 16th is really a confirmation that the Saugeen have also contributed, although the letter is not theirs. This is an interesting letter. I'm not going to go through all 16 letters. I will spare you that, okay? But this one is quite exciting because this comes from Curve Lake, or now in those days, Chemong Lake, which is north of the contemporary Ontario city of Peterborough. And Jason and I have made several visits to Curve Lake in listening exercises to get responses to the letters from contemporaries and elders from these. Chief Peter Nogi writes in very much the same fashion. We read the letter. We consulted with the chiefs. They unanimously agreed. We are poor, but we wish we could give more to our suffering white brethren. And this becomes a formula in almost all of the letters. This one's a little bit different because Peter Nogi says we've had such good relations with our British subjects close by. Those British subjects would be the Peter Robinson settlers from Tipperary, and Cork, who arrived there in one of the few government-sponsored Irish migrations in 1825. In fact, this year they celebrate the 9 ships bicentennial. So, in fact, when Jason and I went to Curve Lake and were listening to some of the women who are elders, one said, "Oh, we love the Irish. My granny was from Innisfore and she's Irish," and more and more of these stories, and they had expressions, and they had engaged with the fact of Irish. And in fact, it was really kind of heartwarming to sit and just listen, not talk, but listen. Okay. And so that letter is a little different. And they offered us a picture of Peter Nogi as well. We didn't have a picture of him before, but this was the chief who wrote the letter. Also, look at what he signs with. His name is signed likely by the transcriber who spoke Anishinaabe-Moan and translated it into English. But here you have his totem, the serpent. Park that idea. There he is. And the other letter I wanted to show you was from Lake Scugog. I live in Whitby, Ontario, and the closest reserve to me is the Mississauga of Scugog. And same formula, same signature, this time by Jacob Crane with his crane totem. But this was a group that had, under treaty, had been allocated lands at Balsam Lake. They were too acidic, they were far north. They virtually had to buy back their former territory to get fertile soils And even though they were on Lake Scugog, they were deprived of all shoreline, and that exists to this day. It was also the smallest reserve in the province, but they gave £5 because that's what they could afford to give. So here's an entire list, okay, of all of the donations that were made based on the Bagot numbers of 8,862. They gave £172, 10 shillings. Some are unknown. Manitoulin Island was unceded territory. It still is. So we have no report from there because essentially Anderson had no jurisdiction over this unceded territory. And constantly governments in Canada have been reminded of that. So this is unceded Ottawa and Ojibwe territory. There is currently at Walpole Island a dispute, so no letter came from Walpole Island, but you can see that practically every other First Nation within the province gave to Irish famine relief. What does this mean? £172, 10 shillings was contemporary £142 sterling, $690 US. Current value, £11,882, 52 pence. That translates, this is old. I did an update. It's about 22,000 Canadian now because of the shifting, the weakness of the Canadian dollar to the British pound in our own time. And that's another story that Mark Carney will have to figure out someday. So that gives you a sense of how much in present value, how much in our own value that this donation was worth. But that's not the important point. It's not to say Canadian Indigenous peoples gave $690 and the Choctaw gave $170. That's not relevant. What's relevant is try to get behind why these donations were made. What is it that these Indigenous groups responded so quickly and so generously given their limited resources? Now, there are a number of theories out there. The first is, religion was a civilizer. Because in American historiography, why do the Cherokee and the Choctaw give? Well, it's because they were civilized and were aspiring, as Annalise Trout says, to bourgeois American middle-class values, and charity was part of that. Okay, so that even in contemporary times, that didn't seem to hold for Canada West. Charles Bagot, the Governor General, said, in Canada West, in the contrary, to which influences of the Jesuits and Roman Catholic clergies did not extend, the Indians remained until a very recent period in a state of barbaric heathenism. So the religious argument goes out the window, even in Bagot's mind in the 1840s, but it should go out the window anyway. Choctaw elder Leanne Howe, whom I mentioned before, she said, this is underestimating our traditions, our culture, our spirit as Choctaw. The whole idea of Ima is built within us to give when others are in need, to give to other members of the family. So to, in a sense, interpret it through a bourgeois American lens is doing a grave disservice to why these donations, at least in this context, are made. This is Peter Jones. He was one of the Ogama chiefs of the Mississaugas of the Credit, and he will figure, of course, this is his portrait at the time. You saw his portrait as interpreted earlier on by Philip Cote, and we'll return to Peter Jones, who, by the way, was a Methodist minister as well as a Mississauga, and actually Methodism was making inroads among the Mississauga largely through Indigenous preachers like Peter Jones, Alan Salt, and others. So, but that is not what would be attributed in the Canadian sense, that somehow these were civilized. There's a loyalty thesis which holds a lot of water, and that is, as I said before, the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg peoples had been essentially in alliance with the British forces during those many colonial wars in the 18th and early 19th century. And so those loyalties remain strong. In fact, this is a very friendly portrait of an Ojibwe warrior who would have been in support of the British armies after 1760. And of course, Joseph Brant, head of the Haudenosaunee and its Six Nations, was granted by Governor Haldeman an entire reserve that we saw on the map before. as a compensation for losing their lands during the American Revolution in upstate New York. So those bonds are very tight. And in fact, today I was at Prony looking at Lord Dufferin, and this is the 1870s. He visited Six Nations. He was the Governor General of Canada, as well as being the landlord at Clandeboye. And the speech made by the Haudenosaunee chiefs at Six Nations reiterated, we have been strong allies in the past. And so this continues. In fact, during World War I, the Six Nations did not want to join the Canadian Expeditionary Force. They wanted to represent themselves because their alliance was with the Crown, not the government of Canada. So that's how strong this loyalty thesis could be. Peter Jones writes in his History of the Ojibwe that the Anishinaabe peoples had kind of a wild, exaggerated sense of who the royal family was. Certainly not something that resonates in Canada today, but they imagined his power, the king's, to be absolute and his authority unlimited, that his word is law, to which all subjects bow with implicit obedience, that his wigwam is the largest in the world. And this is Mississauga Jones reporting on how his own people look at the crown. And by implication, the treaties that they've signed with the crown. Okay, what does this mean? Well, what do these donations actually amount to in real terms to these peoples at the time? Now, it helps going through 1,400 different documents. You see all kinds of requests that come to the government. And so I cherry-picked a few out there just to give you a sense that for example, at Curve Lake, or Mud Lake, it was Chamong as it was called in those days, they gave almost the equivalent of what it would cost for a yoke of oxen, which is absolutely essential if you're engaged in farming in Canada West at that time. So it's not an insignificant amount of money. Others are giving portions of what they would pay a blacksmith or a teacher on the reserve, or close to what it would cost for an interpreter on that reserve, or provisions for a year. When you consider that some of the donations are 20 pounds and 15 pounds, and the provisions, at least for the Ojibwe of St. Clair, we're going to charge 32 pounds, you realize in real terms to them, these are extraordinarily significant donations. And so I think that's a third point to sort of keep in mind. In the case of the Mississauga of the Credit, that would be Peter Jones's band, they were actually going to be moved off their lands within weeks. Within a week of their letter to Anderson, their lands were going to be sold at auction. And that's mentioned in the letter. And it's interesting because Jones writes this letter himself because he can write in English, okay? And in this particular case, he talks about their own problems of starvation. He talks about their own problems of homelessness, and talks about the fact that their own potato crop has failed that particular year. Many forget that the potato blight actually originates in Eastern North America. And of course, he signs this letter with Joseph Sawyer, another chief who leaves his dotem. And of course, as they leave, Jones says, every family has but left behind the sacred dust of their ancestors. So what they give is no small sacrifice in many ways, given their life circumstances. This is a picture of Elder Darren Wabenga, who Jason and I have dealt with at New Credit, because they moved to a section of what was the Haudenosaunee Reserve at Six Nations. So that's now called the New Credit Reserve, okay? As he was reading the letter on a film that Jason made for Irish Heritage Trust, he read this letter, commented on it, as all of the Ogima that we've had read the letters do, and he said, this letter is particularly special for me because Joseph Sawyer, that signatory of the letter, was my 4 times great-grandfather. That makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck when you realize the human connection between this donation and the current leaders and folk at many of these reserves. I think why I called your attention to the Dodomag, the totems. An average English person looking at that letter would say, well, he couldn't write in English, so he just scribbled a picture of an animal to represent himself. And I think the key behind this donation is understanding Totem and what it means, particularly in Anishinaabe culture, who were the majority donating. My colleague at U of T, Heidi Bohacker, says this, and she says it far better than I can. She's the expert on treaties. She said, they inform perspective understanding of time, space, history, law, philosophy, ethics, and most significantly, the foundational relationship between human beings and the world in which human lives. Anishinaabe leaders wrote these images on documents pertaining to their lands at councils held on those lands, reflecting the discussions of those councils. These images are expressions of Anishinaabe law. These were the same symbols that the Anishinaabe people used when they signed treaties with the British Crown. They saw this donation as coming out of those alliances and treaties which were part and parcel of their lives, okay? And here I give you a sense of how many letters are actually signed with Totem, whether it be the crane, whether it be the caribou, here the deer, the serpent. One letter is signed with what looked like a tornado, and I didn't know what that was. And when Jason and I were at Curve Lake, one of the elder women said, I'm getting goosebumps. It's a pukwis. I haven't seen a pukwis since I was a child. And pukwis was essentially when dust or snow blows around like a little tornado across either the top of the snow or sand. And she said, he signed with a pukwis. And she was literally shaking because she hadn't seen it. But all of these describe the Anishinaabe philosophy of what it meant to be in treaty. This was something that was used from time immemorial by Anishinaabe peoples to signify their reciprocal relationship, not their authoritarian relationship over another, but being reciprocal in treaty. I remember hearing not too long ago, Cadmus Delorme, former chief of the Cowessess First Nation in Saskatchewan, described treaties with the Crown as essentially seen by Indigenous peoples as two canoes moving parallel to one another. He said the problem is that the other canoe of the white Europeans tended to move far away and didn't remember that there was another canoe moving side by side with them. And so in many ways, here's the Totem. This is just beautiful. I mean, it really gives you a sense of the Totem as they were used. And some more rare than others. The crayfish you don't see very often, but the bear, the moose, the caribou, the crane, the eagle. But the crane is really considered in the hierarchy of clans to be among the highest. So what does this mean? I talked about treaties as alliances. I also talk about, those canoes moving, but Peter Schmaltz, who's the expert on Ojibwe in our current province of Ontario, I think he says it best when many of the agreements made by the British with the Ojibwe were unconscionable. The few that were agreed upon in good faith were later broken through government manipulation of banned funds. A policy of Indian removal similar to the one in the United States was attempted in Ontario, and that's true as well when it was convenient for the Crown to do so. So in summing up, seeing the famine through an Indigenous lens really kind of broadens our perspectives on famine relief. First of all, it was a reflection of Indigenous generosity and empathy, and you see that in all of the letters. Secondly, the treaties made a people sensitive to the needs of their longtime allies. They saw this as their responsibility as a treaty people. When their brothers on the other side and sisters were in trouble, it was their obligation as a treaty people to come to their aid. The request came from a representative of the Crown because that's who the treaty was made with, the Crown, which is why Anderson is very careful to talk about the Great Mother, Queen Victoria, and the Great Father, Lord Elgin in Montreal. They knew what that would mean. That would be invoking treaty obligation, that these were a people already poor, but gave not out of their superfluous goods, they gave out of them very selves, as you can see, even with Scugog and the oxen, or Mudlake and the oxen. They gave out of their very selves. And of course, the Mississauga of Chemong, as I said before, Mud Lake, acknowledged that there already was a relationship, and a positive relationship among some of these people with Irish settlers who had acquired lands from the treaty and were now settling, particularly in places like Omemee, Douro, Innismore townships all around where the Mississauga lived. And their gift was a responsibility derived from treaties. So that's, as Linus would say, and that's what the donation was all about. So give you a sense, quick overview. And then this gallery, when Jason and I first decided that we would make this into public history in many ways, Jason created the designs here in Ireland. They were sent to Toronto, and they produced the storyboards. And then this was the launch night. So my colleague, Professor Jonathan Hamilton Diabo from Kanawake, Haudenosaunee, who's been so supportive of this project. There's Philip Cote, the artist. So the presentation comes full circle. You saw his art. Here he is. He did a smudge ceremony among all those who were gathered. Duke Redbird. I get emotional. He is Mississauga, or no, he's geez, sorry, Red. He's Saugeen Anishinaabe. He's been with us from day one, offering advice. You'll see him on the film that Jason has made. He's 85 years old. He's an elder and a spokesperson, an advocate, a filmmaker, a poet. But he has been so supportive. Janice McGowan, who is the Irish Consul General for the Republic in Toronto. Jason, and then the scruffy old guy at the end. But it's been the culmination now of hard research that now has moved into a much more public display and explanation of what was the donation, what were the reasons behind the donation. And so it's moved now from Toronto to Ottawa. When I get back from Ireland, I'll be moving it to Six Nations, where it will go on display there. And we've already had some requests to have it moved to other places as well. But it's been received mostly with surprise. With the opening in Ottawa, people were just dumbfounded, gobsmacked, as you would say, by this energy shown by First Peoples at the time. And I think I'll end it there. Oh, yeah.
Absolutely fantastic. And so much to think about, and I'm sure there'll be so many questions coming out of that. Can I maybe be cheeky and ask the first question?
You may.
I've actually got so many, but I'll try and curtail my enthusiasm. You mentioned Lord Dufferin and Clandeboy. Have you come across, or was there any sense in which, as Governor General, that Dufferin was aware of this connection, any reference to sort of that connection between First Nations and famine relief in Ireland? Because I know it's something he was interested in an Irish context.
I haven't come across anything so far. The one thing that is clear is that he had a relationship with the Six Nations, as I mentioned before, but he also had a relationship with the Métis population of Red River, who would not have been involved in famine relief because they were part of Rupert's Land, Hudson Bay Company territory at the time. But he saw that the Métis, French Métis particularly, as a bridge between the white settler colonists, as we would say now, and Indigenous peoples, because they were half-breeds in the letter. And even going through materials today, he was very sensitive to the fact that when they resisted Canadian takeover of Red River, which is now Manitoba, or part of Manitoba, he was quite quick to look at ways of exonerating or pardoning those who had been captured and faced execution. And the interesting thing there was the connection with Clandeboy was Thomas Scott, who was an Ontario Orangeman who was with a group of surveyors, was actually captured by the Métis, by Louis Riel, and sentenced to death. He was executed, and Thomas Scott's father was actually a tenant on the Clandeboy estate. So there's all these ties between Lord Dufferin and what was going on with Indigenous policies in Canada. And he was also deeply concerned about the Indigenous peoples of British Columbia. He actually made a trip to British Columbia in 1876. There are several memoranda on that, but nothing in the correspondence that I've seen so far indicates that he knew about this particular donation. So the donations from the Canadian organization would have gone directly to Dublin, to the Central Relief Committee in Dublin. The church donations would have gone, I've found two connections, certainly Archbishop Murray, Daniel Murray, and he became a clearinghouse for it. I've gone through his correspondence at this end and at the Canadian end. And interestingly enough, there was one priest in the Ottawa Valley who also collected, his name was McNulty, from Indigenous peoples who were working in the lumber camp. So Indigenous, Irish, French, you name it, he collected a substantial amount of money. And that was sent to Archbishop McHale of Tuam because this Father McNulty was from County Mayo. So it was just, I'm going to the trusted receiver that I know the money will be coming out. But for Dufferin, no, it's
interesting. I just talked about religion. I noticed you touched on it a few times through your presentation, but you mentioned that this very ecumenical approach in Canada. Where was this? Was it channeled in an ecumenical way when it reached Ireland? I mean, obviously some goes to Catholic churches, some goes to Dublin. Did any of it come north?
Yes, so as far north as Scotland, because there were a number of individuals in Scotland who were targeted for the Scottish donation, and they would have all been Protestant, they wouldn't have been Catholic. Archbishop, the Church of Ireland Archbishop in Dublin was also given money out of this fund for distribution as well. So it was. Now, not to look at this too ironically, I'm going to be talking later about the general relief efforts when I'm in Strokestown later this week. Jason, you can cover your ears, but I discovered the relief effort in a place called Guelph, Ontario, which is about 60 miles to the west of Toronto. There's a university there as well. But in those days, it was an agricultural town and one very much divided along Protestant Catholic lines. And so on one column of the newspaper, there's all of this benevolent Irish relief. And in the next column, it's the murder of Richard Oliver by Charles Coghlan in one of the family feuds between an Irish Protestant settler family and an Irish Catholic settler family. And of course, Charles Coghlan is eventually executed. But cheek by jowl to generosity and ecumenism is the old orange-green question as it arises among the settler colonists. So,
Pope Pius IX's encyclical, Shores Nostros. Was that of any influence? You mentioned, I think earlier you mentioned that some of the Indigenous people were linked to the Catholic Church. I just wondered the influence of that encyclical, how
and it is influential secondhand. So when Pius IX issues the encyclical, Archbishop Signet in Quebec and Bishop Bourget in Montreal, Bishop Walsh in Halifax, they all respond, and there's a trickle-down effect. So Signet publishes for donations, and that's where his Catholic Indigenous flock sort of come to the fore. Also, the Mohawk of Kanawake are also Catholic, and unlike the Mohawk at Six Nations or the Mohawk at Tyendinaga, which is closer to the city of Kingston today, and there's an interesting story there as well. But yeah, so the encyclical was kind of like, it was the blessing on making sure that the money was collected, but they were collecting even before the encyclical. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for such a wonderful paper. I mean, this is important research, and it's for us. We see really great public history as well. So my question is about how you weigh up the relative influences of two, at least theoretically, quite distinct motivations for charitable engagement. both with regard to the First Nations you're talking about, and potentially also comparatively with other subaltern groups who also in other places respond to this global charitable call for Ireland. So the weighting you should be giving primacy to is a sovereignty argument, that through responding to this charitable call from the Canadian authorities, the First Nation communities are asserting their sovereignty. And I think, Annalise Short makes a similar argument for the Charter in response to their search for sovereignty as a motivation for their image. But you also mentioned empathy. You mentioned in your engagements with First Nation peoples today that the argument this is also empathetic. But this is empathy that involves imagining an empathetic object which cannot be seen, which is really very unusual, and requires some explanation as to what exactly the mechanisms of that empathy are. I'm asking this because I'm thinking about other altering groups who give us who don't have the sovereignty motivation, but also do have some kind of empathetic reaction. People like free Black communities in Boston contributing to the New England appeal, or former slaves in the British Caribbean islands contributing to the British Association appeal as well, places like Trinidad and Montserrat, which is quite surprising, So that can't be explained through those groups asserting sovereignty, but it does also require this empathetic leap to make the connection with the unseen, distant White community in Ireland. So I'm just wondering, in the material you've looked at for your cases in Canada, how might we understand that empathetically?
So we can understand it in a number of ways. First is that unwritten up until very recently is the way in which Indigenous peoples lived within their own cultural groups and how they related to their other cultural groups that were essentially close by to them. And there again, you see over and over again that empathy and what we would call charity or giving was important, particularly in terms of these alliances between people, because the whole concept of sovereignty in terms of treaties with the Crown is anticipated by generations and generations of similar treaties between Indigenous peoples themselves, where they come to one another's aid for a variety of reasons. I think the next level is to take a look at those who didn't have such an abstract idea of, my white suffering brethren, so many miles away. That's why that letter from Chemong Lake or Curve Lake or Mud Lake, change names, is so important, because they can relate to this Irish problem, because they have Irish people that they've lived and worked with, and they see it. And at the same time, at Kanawake, they see the suffering, across the river from themselves. And so their empathy is much more direct than indirect or abstract. And I would say that the third level is really Haudenosaunee, and that is this sort of traditional loyal relationship that they have with the British. And that is that they have been military allies, from the earliest of the colonial wars. And this is part of what they do in alliance. A little bit different from the way in which the Anishinaabe-Reed treaty, but very similar. And it's really curious because, I still haven't figured it out because I'm a settler colonist and I don't know. That's why we go on these listening exercises to talk to or listen to elders rather, and get a sense of what these mean. And for example, when Jonathan here from Kanawake first saw it, he said it's so important, these letters, because Canadians look at us as taking, and that's not our tradition. Our tradition is to give, and give in so many ways. And at least now we have evidence to disprove, the common assumptions that Indians just take and continue to take. but it's complicated. Nathan Brinklow, who teaches Mohawk language at Queen's University, Kingston, is part of the Tyendinaga Reserve. And when he looked at this letter, and he's on film as well, we had a ceremony in Ottawa at the Irish Embassy residence where we planted 3 silver birch. One was planted by Claudette Commanda of the Anishinaabe Algonquin in unceded territory. Eamon McKee, the ambassador, planted the other, and they asked me on behalf of settlers to plant the 3rd. But at that ceremony, Nathan Brinklow, dressed accordingly in his Mohawk ceremonials, he said, "What I find really unusual about this is that one colonized people is helping another colonized people and using the language of the colonizer." And so what he did is he took the Haudenosaunee letter from Tyendinaga and he translated it into Mohawk and read it, and you could hear a pin drop, because he said, "This is the way my people would have expressed it in their own tongue." We're still learning, but your question is excellent, because this works on so many levels. Yeah.
I was going to say, oh, sorry. No, sorry. Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. I've got loads of questions, but I will start with one. I was just wondering, you mentioned that each of these letters kind of followed similar patterns. It reminded me of Lindsay and Burns' work on how people learn to ask for charity, especially women. And I was just wondering, do you know if these nations are corresponding with each other, or are the missionaries kind of helping to kind of fit these into certain patterns?
Now, some of the nations would have missionaries and others would not. But the patterns seem to follow, as Heidi Bohacker would say, the way in which discussion and deliberation is done, particularly among the Anishinaabe. And that's why I said sort of park the idea that we read the letter, or maybe it was read to us, depending on which band. We gathered in council. We unanimously agreed. And we're going to say that you can take this amount from our annuity. So this is from the government funds that would be forwarded to them by treaty, which they had to apply for. So that's how we find out about how much oxen cost and all of that, because anytime they want something, they have to go, cap in hand, so to speak, to the department to get the money. So it follows a pattern that seems to be rote, but until you realize the way in which at least the Anishinaabe leaders worked in a consensual way, it seems to follow that pattern quite nicely. And I think that's why the Chemong Lake letter is so interesting, is because independently they say, well, we know these people, they've been our neighbors, and we want to help them. So at first I thought, oh gosh, this is really very formulaic. But then again, when you understand the way in which the Anishinaabe engage in alliance and treaty, this is really an important commonality between the way in which it's done. Interesting, the Six Nations letter is very short, as is the letter from Tyendinaga. It's a bit longer. Those are the Haudenosaunee letters. The Huron-Wendat are part of one letter that comes from an amalgam of groups in the far west. I don't have my map up there, but where the city of Sarnia would be today, in that area. And there's Wyandotte, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe, but it's done in the formula of the majority there, which is Anishinaabe, the Potawatomi, and the Ojibwe. Yeah.
I was just going to say, as far as the motivation goes, and the traditional systems, which obviously of governance and the way they did things, I'm just wondering, how much do you think the likes of potlatch, for instance, traditional Indigenous one, where the tradition of the ceremony itself is to give, and you receive honor for giving, the more you give, the more you get as a community basis. And those systems obviously being replaced during, with the installation of the Indian Act, but before that, as a motivation, and not just, as Peter was saying, the sovereignty, those traditional community practice, cultural practices like potlatch would have, factored in. And
gift giving,
yeah,
which was extraordinarily important, as Anishinaabe were were forging alliances with other Anishinaabe, and then it became an important feature of the crown relationship that there would be an annual gift giving. Yeah. Yeah.
How much do you think sort of factored in? It wasn't just the religious aspect or the treaty aspect, but those traditional systems that would have been, I don't know, almost their own way of.
But that would be also embedded in
Yeah.
their spirituality and understanding of them, their own sense of peoplehood and who they were and how they behave. And the potlatch more akin to Northwest Coast as opposed to Anishinaabe in the center, or as Lord Dufferin would call them, the Wood Indians, as opposed to the Plain Indians. Yeah. So yeah. But another interesting thought as we try to sort of sort this out.
I have a comment. As we're here in Belfast, there's a complicated Belfast connection with the donation from Ganawag and from Christine Zachary Dion. As you mentioned, I recorded with her 6 years ago now at the Black Rock, the Famine Memorial in Montreal. She also published 2 pieces, almost identical, about that donation. And she makes 2 claims which are kind of contradictory. She says, on the one hand, there's a strong oral tradition of a small donation being made through the Catholic Church, which is correct. There's archival evidence of that, recently discovered archival evidence of that. 6.5 pounds donated through the parish of Sault Ste. Louis. No mention whatsoever of Ganawag Indigenous peoples, and a pretty hard reference to find.
Yeah, it was almost impossible until we sort of figured out that's the way the settlers would see that particular part of the world.
Yes. Yeah. But she also says it was the visit to Ganawag by the Lord Mayor of Belfast, Tom Hartley, Sinn Féin, in 2009, which really was the catalyst for awakening this memory, this consciousness of the donation. And on camera, she says, he did the research, which is just not plausible. I mean, I understand he's a historian. He has had an exhibit in the Ulster Museum, but there's absolutely no way he did the research to find that. And I've been puzzled by this for a long time.
You and me both.
Like he's not confusing Ganawag with the Choctaw.
I think he probably is, but I mean, because other than what we've discovered from the newspapers at Sault Ste. Louis, that £6, 5 shilling donation, we only have the oral tradition upon which to work, and she was the one who brought the oral tradition to light.
But while crediting Tom Hartley, it's a contradiction.
Yeah. But then saying again on film that without the reference to Tom Hartley that we gave. And according to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we have to treat oral evidence in the same light as we treat sola scriptura in that sense, is that others that we've talked to have been puzzled by this at Ganawag. Jonathan was, and he was helping us open doors there to figure out whether this figure of $150 is But I would accept.
My hypothesis is he knows of the
Tom
Hartley, the plaque in Mansion House in Dublin, which does pay tribute to First Nations both in Upper Canada and Lower Canada.
Right.
As it turns out, it's only 3 in Lower Canada. Right.
Yeah. That we found so far.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think he got lucky.
If we someone who would have invited Tom Hartley. Answer your question.
I tried to get in touch, but
Tom Hartley.
no response.
Thanks very much, Mark. Just on the empathetic responses and the ethic of sharing, could you not say in a way this is a feature of most, if not all, subsistence producers, of which the Indigenous peoples would be an example? I'm thinking of poorer peasantry across Western Europe and so on, or indeed in pre-famine Ireland, phrases involving much more of this than I would, but corn gorse, and there's a in other words, emphasizing interdependencies between people, between very poor people who are subject to the vicissitudes of weather and price fluctuations and so on. So in a way, that ethic of sharing, one might think of as a form of social insurance. And certainly that's very clear in pre-famine Irish society. It breaks down during the Great Famine because the crisis is so overwhelming. But in the smaller subsistence crises, there are many indications for this. But, this is the big but, that has a kind of a logic within the context of subsistence producers in a particular region who can help each other out. But your examples, they're giving money, resources to people who will never reciprocate or are extremely unlikely to ever reciprocate. So it makes it all the more fascinating in a way that that ethic of sharing would go beyond simply rational self-interest, social insurance mechanisms, or whatever.
It's a really interesting way. I mean, I've never thought of putting it within the context of subsistence cultures elsewhere, trying to sort of directly sort of tap what were the indigenous traditions and the networks that they create, and then the treaties that they subscribe to. But having said that, they would have understood treaty as being, they do the same for us, because that's how we see treaty, is that in our previous alliances and treaties, it's been a reciprocity between equals, as opposed to the way in which they engage in treaties with another party who doesn't see them as equals, that sees this as a way of securing title and seizing land, because the understanding of particularly Anishinaabe peoples in this particular part of the world is that, well, we're sharing the land. We haven't ceded it. It's not till the 1830s, for example, that the Crown decides that in order to protect the Indians from settlers, is that we will incorporate their lands as Crown lands, and ever since then we have Crown lands and major confrontations. Now in my home province of Ontario, we have this area in the northeast of the province called the Ring of Fire, where all kinds of rare minerals, of course, are there. And now the government of Ontario has decided that they want to fast track, the extrication of these minerals, particularly given what's going on in the United States and China and the like. And of course, bypassing the indigenous peoples who actually hold those lands. And so there's a major conflict brewing in Canada over the whole question of Crown land and indigenous land. For example, Duke would say, give us our land back. You just took it. It's not their understanding of treaty, or the understanding of treaty is reciprocity in this particular case. And we haven't seen much of that. And that's why I put the Schmaltz slide up there, because he said, these treaties were negotiated with one set of ideas on one side and another on the other side. And I mean, what we read in these letters is a true generosity of spirit among people who really didn't have all that much. And in a sense, when Peter Jones's letter is quite pointed, is that, listen, we've known starvation, we've known crop failure, we're now looking at deportation, essentially, but we're still going to give.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really fascinating. I was wondering whether there was concern about, is there any evidence of concern that the aid was reaching the people it was intended for? Was there any concern with having checks that it was reaching people?
Not in the
mention of it going to the Archbishop of Tuam.
Yeah, well, you have to see that in that particular case, you could imagine Father McNulty just going to the timber shanties and saying, I'm collecting, the Irish people are dying and we've got to do something about it. And then, passing the clerical hat and then everybody sort of pitching in and then going on to cut more timber. And I mean, and knowing that he was the only priest in the Upper Ottawa Valley at that point, and he's walking through the snow and proverbial snow in 50 to 100 miles, to go from shanty to shanty and collect them. And there'd be no record of it, no receipts, no tax benefit or anything like that. They threw a few shillings into a hat or a few pence, depending, and the lumber barons would throw a few pounds in. But and interestingly enough, there seems to be no follow-up to these letters at all. So if that's trusting that the job was done and the people would be treated. But this question has come up since we started doing this 2 years, is where did the money go? And how did they know it arrived there? And we've now discovered that it did arrive at these various destinations as we sort of prodded to see who received the money. But I knew that Archbishop Murray, because I went through Murray's papers several years ago, sort of on a completely different subject, and that is, his connections with Canada during the famine, and then discovering that money was coming to him and being distributed. And I think, Liam, I referred you to some of those letters because his priests were reporting back the dead, and when you were doing the project on the dead lists, and
Thank you. That was great. Really interesting. Thank you. I was just wondering, is it unique in terms of territories that were controlled the British Crown, colonies, what we call them? Was the response of Upper North Canada unique in those terms? Because I was struck in some of the things you were saying from the little I know of the Maori in New Zealand, that their attitude to treaties was similar and how they were seen doing treaties with the British. And absolutely their attitude towards the Crown, that they had an independent relationship with the Crown and didn't need to seek the permission of, if you like, what we now call the vice settlers. So within the British world, was the reaction of the Indigenous peoples in Canada, to the best of your knowledge, distinctive or unique, or was it parallel anyway about what happened in Europe?
No, I mean, so far, this is what we've discovered in terms of donations from these Indigenous. I mean, other work has been done on the Caribbean, but I wouldn't call the slaves there to be Indigenous. They were brought there against their will. But this is common within the colonies, that at least the British colonies that we've come across. But as yet, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and New Brunswick have been prodding to see if Micmac or Maliseet have donated, and nothing so far. So there didn't seem to be a coordinating body in those provinces sort of drawing funds as donations. Montreal seemed to be the hub, and all of these colonies are reporting into Montreal with funds. So that's another question that wouldn't mind exploring and sort of putting this in a much more global or imperial context as to where these are situated. In some ways, the research is still pretty raw, but that makes it fun because the realm of possibility is still out there.
Well, that's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Mark, thank you so much for coming and sharing this with us, and all the best as the research continues. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Sure.